Hmm. So now with that bodhicitta motivation in mind, we can do the reverse of refuge and bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I can see everybody. So, I guess we'll return to the text and pick up where we left off. And one quick comment is like, so we're on, we're just a reminder. We're in the section chapter, the second of the four. Each there are each of the four tenet systems, right? Has its own section. So we're on the second of the four, the Sutra school or the Sautrantikas, and each of them has 7 points, or on the fifth of the 7, which is the way of asserting object possessors, which means the way of asserting consciousness, right? Mind. Or, well, not just mind, mainly mind, but knowers, and one other point I was going to say is, we covered last time, it's just like we're covering just a little bit of pramana, which is sometimes called valid cognition. And in particular, that what's covered here really mainly of that is lorig in Tibetan, mind and awareness. So it's kind of that's not, obviously we're studying tenets, not mind and awareness. That's a whole module of FPMT's basic program of mind and awareness. But because the Sautrantikas were such important explicators of pramana in general, of valid cognition, and particularly of mind and awareness, it's almost like there's a little primer in this chapter, in this section on mind and awareness. And last time, we covered how pramana, valid cognizer, here they call it a valid cognizer, a valid cognition. We covered that there are 2 types. There are valid cognizers and non-valid cognizers. And then the definition of a valid cognizer, I just want to remind people, right, was a new, in this school, right? Prasangikas don't include new, but all the other schools do. So a new, incontrovertible or indisputable knower. So we covered that, and then we were starting to go into more detail about what are valid cognizers. And we mentioned last time there are 2 types. There are direct valid cognizers and inferential valid cognizers, right? And I'll just mention, because we're going to pick up there, the definition of a direct valid. They were differentiating also. The definition of a direct perceiver is a non-mistaken knower that is free of conceptuality. Right? Whereas the definition of a direct valid cognizer is a new incontrovertible knower free from conceptuality. Right. So, and you get the difference. So not all correct perceptions are valid cognizers, because according to this school, it has to be new. To be a valid cognizer at one point is it has to be a new incontrovertible knower. So then it says, I'll just continue on with the text here. And this part we'll just go through, I think, not just, it's fairly straightforward. So there are 4 types of direct. So there are 2 types in general of valid cognizers, direct and inferential, right? So, and we already said it. So a direct one is free of conceptuality, right? Whereas an inferential one arises through the power of a reason. So it's by nature, its very nature is conceptual, right? So they're different. There are conceptual valid cognizers and then non-conceptual. So direct valid cognizer is non-conceptual. So it says here, there are 4 types. So now we're going to go into a little more detail about direct valid cognizers, right? Which means non-conceptual, new incontrovertible knowers, free of conceptuality, right? Non-conceptual, free of conceptuality. So I'll just list them and then we'll go through them. So the 4 types of direct valid cognizers are self-knowing direct valid cognizers, sense direct valid cognizers, mental direct valid cognizers, and yogic direct valid cognizers. And they're all listed in the text on page 10. But now we're going to go through, and Judson Shogi Gelson defines each one. So we'll go through his way of presenting them. So he says, the definition of a self-knowing direct valid cognizer is a new incontrovertible knower that is free from conceptuality, only inwardly directed, and just an apprehender. And remember, so this self-knowing, we're not going to go into detail here about this, but remember, a self-knower, according to this school, is how they explain memory, how they explain that, like, so if I say, if I say, oh, as a kid, I saw the Statue of Liberty, right? It's not just, I don't only have a memory of the Statue of Liberty, I have a memory that I saw it, right? And so they would say, how do I remember that? I must have seen in other words, there must have been a valid cognition of me seeing it in order to later remember that I saw it. And so what they're saying is, that first moment of seeing myself, so it says directed inwardly, only inward, means that first moment of seeing myself, seeing the Statue of Liberty would have been a direct, self-knowing direct valid cognizer, right? So it's like we don't actually, and we're not generally aware of the self-knowing valid cognizers, but this school would say the proof that we have them is that we remember later that we had a certain experience. So that's a self-knowing direct valid cognizer. The next one actually is the one that us ordinary people are mostly aware of when we talk about direct valid cognizers, and that's a sense direct valid cognizer, right? That's the one that as ordinary persons we are aware of. So it says the definition of a sense direct valid cognizer is a new incontrovertible knower free from conceptuality that arises in dependence upon the physical sense power that is its uncommon empowering condition. So what does that mean? Let's just go through it briefly, right? So first of all, it's a new incontrovertible knower free of conceptuality. That means it's a direct valid cognizer, right? But now we're going to add, what is sense direct valid cognizer? So what they're saying, remember, physical sense power. So here's the important part here. A sense direct valid cognizer is a consciousness, right? And what they're saying here is this kind of consciousness, this kind of new non-conceptual knower, right, free of, is, in this case, it arises in dependence upon a physical sense power. So that what that means is, like if I hear a bird outside, right, what they're saying is that sense, the ear sense power, or rather, so the ear consciousness apprehends sound, right, in dependence upon a physical sense power, meaning the ear, right, the ear sense power, the auditory sense power. If I open my eyes and see a patch of green, which I just saw, look out the window, it's green, that would be, right, independence upon the physical sense power of the eye senses, right? So the physical set, and remember though, in the Vaibhashika school, the physical sense powers were called knowers. In this school, only a consciousness. In this school and all the ones above it, only consciousnesses are knowers, right? Or only consciousnesses are valid cognizers, you should say. But so these kinds of sense direct valid cognizers, obviously they arise in dependence upon sense organs. Does that make sense? The same thing, if you feel something touch your skin, right, it's dependent upon that sense power, right? And so, or they say uncommon empowering condition, right? Because only the ear sense power can give is the unique and uncommon empowering condition for auditory consciousness. Only the eye sense power is the uncommon meaning it's the only thing that serves as that, right? Only the eye can serve as the empowering condition for a visual consciousness to arise, and only the tactile sense power can give rise to tactile consciousness. You can't see with your ears and so on. So those are sense direct valid cognizers. Then the next one, and then I'll pause when I get to the end of these and see if there are questions. But the next one is the definition of a mental direct valid cognizer. And they're all going to begin the same way, right, with a valid cognizer. So a new incontrovertible knower free from conceptuality, which is always there. In this case, that arises in dependence upon the mental sense power that is its uncommon empowering condition. So here I just pause. So what does that mean, right? A mental direct valid cognizer. So what they're saying is there are certain kinds of mental knowers that are non-conceptual. Right? I'll give a few examples. So what would be a mental sense power that's a mental valid direct valid cognizer that's non-conceptual? Because most of our mental events are conceptual, aren't they? So there are different types of this, and I'll just mention them. One is, in Buddhism, if you studied Buddhism much, then you know there are many different kinds of clairvoyance, for example, right, according to Buddhism. People who have gained calm abiding can give rise to clairvoyance, where they directly perceive, there are different types, right? One is where you can directly perceive somebody else's thoughts or feelings. That would be a direct perception that's mental. It's not through your eyes, your ears, your nose, your tactile sense. And they actually say that, reliable clairvoyance arises as dependence upon the achievement of calm abiding. It's a side effect of attaining shamatha. But then also there are certain people, they say, where due to the force of karma, they can have a clairvoyant experience. So they don't have calm abiding, but because of their karma, they can see something, or see something that somebody else feels, or see something somebody else sees. Or sometimes they say that, many people describe that. There are texts, that describe it. Lama Yeshe describes that in some of his teachings. But anyway, where somebody, because of their meditation, they can see something that happens far away, right? And they don't see it, they see an event that happens. They don't see it with their eyes, they see it with their mental consciousness. So that would be an example of a mental direct valid cognizer. There's one other one I'll just mention very briefly. I mentioned it in one of the other classes very briefly. There's also a process which we're not aware of, but they say happens, where when you have a sense direct valid cognizer, then there's an instant where so if you're seeing, if I look out the window and I see an object, there's a moment where there's literally one moment, they say, in Buddhist psychology, in this tenet system, where then there's a mental direct valid cognizer of that object. And then and that's just one instant, and then it becomes conceptual. We're not aware of that. The only Aryas are aware of that experience. So we're not aware that that's happening, but they say it happens. So the main experience that a non-Arya would have of mental direct valid cognizers would be some kind of clairvoyance. And those karmic ones, actually, you hear of people like that, don't you? Sometimes, like somebody says they woke up and they said, I knew my so-and-so, I knew my best friend died, or something of that sort. And then they get the call that the person died, so that would be an experience of, where the person actually knows, like there's a kind of actual knowing. That would be what they call karmic clairvoyance or something, where there's no way to, it wasn't one of their senses that knew that, but due to the force of karma, they had some kind of ability to know a certain thing. It's not, when it's arisen through the power of calm abiding, it's reliable. When it's not so reliable, but both can happen, they say. And then the last of these kinds of direct valid cognizers is the yogic direct valid cognizer. And in this school, they say the definition of a yogic direct valid cognizer, and again, notice it begins with the definition of direct valid cognizer in general. So but it starts with an exalted wisdom now that directly realizes. So it's an exalted wisdom. Remember, it's a new. It actually doesn't say it here, but it's always going to be a new, incontrovertible knower free of conceptuality. So here it's that's an exalted wisdom that directly realizes either subtle impermanence or coarse or subtle selflessness of persons, in dependence upon the meditative stabilization that is a union of calm abiding and special insight that is its uncommon empowering condition. And that notes there are three types of yogic direct valid cognizers. Valid cognizers directly realize subtle impermanence. those that realize coarse selflessness, and those that realize subtle selflessness. So here, like, again, they have this phrase, uncommon empowering condition, right? So with a sense direct valid cognizer, the uncommon empowering condition is a sense organ, right? This sense power, the physical part. Here, the uncommon empowering condition is the union of calm abiding and special insight. Right? So in other words, you can't give rise, what they're saying then, right? Just like a person with no eyes can't see, right? Won't give rise to a visual experience. What they're saying here is a person who doesn't have the union of calm abiding and special insight, so the union of shamatha and vipassana, that's the only way, that's the uncommon and unique empowering condition for yogic direct valid cognizers. So only somebody who's already achieved calm abiding and then already done the process of combining calm abiding with special insight until they can actually experience them together, right? And those who studied Lamrim know, right, that there's a whole process where at first, after you achieve calm abiding, that comes first, actually, right? First, you achieve calm abiding. And then for a beginner who just achieved calm abiding, when they try to contemplate, right, to give rise to an insight, their concentration weakens. Right? And then they get better and better at combining the two until there comes a point where their process of giving rise to insight actually enhances their concentration. Right? And then that leads to this experience of the union of calm abiding and special insight. And so what we're getting at here is that a person who has achieved that level of meditation, then that becomes the uncommon empowering condition and remember here, so it's a non-conceptual experience, right? That is what we're getting at. So it's a free of conceptuality, a new incontrovertible knowing of one of these three things, right? So one of them is subtle impermanence, right? And so remember, I'll just go through each of these just to say what they are. So subtle impermanence there's gross impermanence, right? Gross impermanence would be knowing I'm going to die. Gross impermanence is knowing someday all things that come together fall apart, that all relationships will end, that homes and countries and mountains eventually end, that all, that's gross impermanence. Subtle impermanence is the understanding that things change instant by instant, right? That things don't abide for a second instant unchanged. And so here, a yogic direct valid cognizer of that would be a non-conceptual, like a new incontrovertible knower free of conceptuality, right? That realizes subtle impermanence. So that would be a yogi meditating who realizes, for example, that his or her own body doesn't remain for a second instant unchanged. Then the second of the three, right? Valid cognizers directly realizing coarse selflessness of persons. So remember, that would be like the yogi would be meditating and would realize in a way that directly with a new incontrovertible knower free of conceptuality, they would realize the lack of a permanent unitary independent self. Right? So they would realize that they themselves lack any permanent unitary independent self. And that would be the experience of the valid cognizer directly realizing coarse selflessness of persons. And the last of these three, right, the valid cognizer directly realizing the subtle selflessness of persons, would be if the yogi had given rise to this experience I mentioned of the union of calm abiding and special insight, where the special insight was the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent person, right, which is different, right? Subtler. That's why. So that's subtler than the lack of a permanent, unitary, independent person. Here is the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self of themselves, right? And so if that yogi were to give rise to a non-conceptual, new, incontrovertible knowing that they themselves lack that kind of self, that would be this last kind. And at that point, right, actually, and just to make a side point here, when the yogi had this yogic direct valid cognizer of their own lack of having a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, right? At that point, that person would become an Arya, right? An Arya being. They would have realized selflessness directly, according to this school. That would be their direct realization of selflessness, and they would become a stream enter, you could say, somebody who's an Arya being, who's a noble being, we say, translate that, right, who's realized selflessness directly. So that ends this little section, the subsection on direct valid cognizers. Next comes the section on inferential valid cognizers. So I'll just pause. Any questions about direct valid cognizers from that short section?
I have a question, Dr. Lauren.
Oh, Cynthia first and then John.
So this was a question I had actually from last time, but also related to this. I think it might be the sense direct. So how do you distinguish then? I'm still confused on how you distinguish between what we call our base instincts. Like the examples given last time, I totally got confused because some of it seemed to me is what we call our instincts, which I thought has always been what we are trying to overcome, which is the basis of our fears and attachments and all that stuff. So how would I know to differentiate? Like in the moment that something happens, when you use the example of the blue collar, how do I know that that's not coming from something I've had from beginning of time? Does that make sense? So
I'm not sure I understand.
Oh,
sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. The kind of when our instinct happens in that also kind of almost without the consciousness, like that's just this, right? That when instincts of fear or that, so in that moment, so how do I distinguish between that and what we're talking about in terms of the valid cognition?
So I understand. When you say instincts, you mean but emotional, like fear, or are you talking about things like that? Like you're not talking about like the instinct for seeing blue or something. You're talking about like the instinct of fear or anger or those kind of things, or?
No, not even that. We don't. I mean that there's no anger when. So because one of the examples used last time was with a baby kind of reacting. So for me, so that moment that someone says that's blue, or someone, or the I kind of consciousness, or a sense of touching or feeling, how do you distinguish between that and the actual basic instincts that we're supposed to be overcoming, because it's been with us since beginningless time, such as the fear of something or fear or attachment version. Is that making sense?
Yeah. Well, tell me if I'm not sure if I'm getting it or not. So let me double check. Because I get it. Like there was, I think last time it was Sujata gave I think you're getting it like the example. Maybe Sujata gave the example of like when she was on the train station and the baby that was not yet born, right? Reacted with fear, I think, to the sound of the horn of the train. Maybe it was or something. I think it was that.
Even the recognition of a blue. I don't know that that's not conceptual, actually. So, because some animals do recognize blue and some animals don't. So for me, that is base instinct, which is coming from conceptual, which is within us from beginningless time.
Oh, I think I get what you're asking. Maybe better now. And I guess it's I just think because I also want to differentiate because the Prasangika school and this school would answer this, I think would address this kind of issue in a somewhat different ways. So how would, I want to leave aside Prasangika answer and answer from this school's perspective. Um, I guess I'll say a few things. Like one is, I'm trying to say there, so first of all, yes, of course. So this school would agree, right? All schools, all Buddhist schools would agree that we have instincts that go back from beginningless time. That's one point. And then it's interesting though, right? According to this school, there are certain things that are, it's an interesting point you're getting at, I think, which is like, yeah, I'm thinking of the Prasangeek answer, but I don't want to give that. Like, what this guy I think would say, right, is that I'm trying to go back to the most basic part of your question, like the so what this guy would say is when we're talking about direct valid cognition, it really is non-conceptual. But so in other words, there's not a concept, for them. And but I guess, and what they would say actually though is that of course, I'm just pausing. It differs depending upon your, like let's use the example of sense direct valid cognizers, right? That we just covered. So a sense direct valid cognizer, right? We said is an new incontrovertible knower, free from conceptuality. So it's free from conceptuality, right? And it arises in dependence upon the physical sense power that is uncommon empowering condition. We just went over that definition. So I think that gets at your question in a way, which is that according to this school, right, like, first of all, like different kinds of beings would have differences in their sense powers, right? In other words, we know that, like, for example, an insect has a different kind of sense power than a human being does. Their senses work differently. And this school would say, like, hungry ghosts have different kinds of sense powers than human beings, but their sense powers, or they still have a sense power. In other words, because they have a physical body that's different than ours. So according to this school, I think what they would say is in dependence upon a certain being's, the nature of their sense power, right, which is different for different kinds of beings, that the I consciousness does perceive blue or red or certain basic, for example, colors and shapes. And that is connected, of course, you're right, though, it's connected to our past karma, right? Like, so they would give an example where, like, I'll give an example of like a mental, I think this might be getting at your point, so I'll just continue on with this. So a sense direct valid cognizer of a baby, I'm going to use that as the example, right? So if a baby hears, let's say a baby hears their mother going, like, singing a sweet song, like a baby song or something. Like, from this school's perspective, the ear consciousness of that baby is the uncommon empowering condition, right? And it gives rise to a new incontrovertible knower of sound in that moment. And one of the, what do they call the always present mental factors is feeling. And you're right, though, because of previous conditioning, like a baby might feel pleasure of the three kinds of feeling. Like there's pleasant feelings, unpleasant feeling, and neutral feeling. So the baby would feel pleasant feeling, let's say. If the mother sing a song, usually most babies, not all, but most babies would have a sense of a pleasant feeling associated with that mental direct valid cognizer. And all of that, it's interesting, all of that is non-conceptual according to the school. So it's not conceptual, but the feeling, because feelings accompany all cognizers according to all Buddhist schools. So like that all cognizers are accompanied by a pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling. So in that sense, all of that would be free of conceptuality, so the baby, that or even an adult, but certainly a baby at that point would not be thinking this is pleasant. That's not a conscious thought, but there would be an actual experience of pleasure in that instant of sound consciousness in my example. And in the same way, if the baby heard like some very loud, extremely loud horn or something like that, there would be the uncommon empowering condition would be the ear consciousness. It would apprehend this loud horn, and it would give rise to let's say, in that case, a feeling, unpleasant feeling. And according to this school, all of that would be non-conceptual. But you're right also that, in other words, from a Buddhist perspective, if you were to say, well, why then is one pleasant and the other unpleasant? We'd have to say, well, one is it's connected to the nature of those particular sense powers, but it's also because of previous conditioning. So in other words, so what this school would have to say is that, I think it's getting what you're saying here, is that there can be non-conceptual experiences that are still influenced by our previous karmic conditioning. And so that arises due to the one conditioning is the actual nature of our sense, because also some people have more sensitive and some have less sensitive senses even, right? Like, so, one person might experience a certain sound like it's too loud and somebody else might not. So that's, karma that gave rise to these particular sense powers in our body. But also, like, it's true, right? There is some people find certain things pleasant and others find them unpleasant, the same phenomena even, right? But that's due to previous karmic conditioning, but it's not. So in this school, that initial moment of it, though, would not be conceptual, but it would still be conditioned, if that makes sense. So is that getting at the essence of your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good. And then John had a comment or a question too. Oh, you're muted. Oh, there you go.
Yeah. I think my question may be simpler, but maybe not. I was not at the last class, so maybe you've already answered this question, but the three things that all direct, valid cognizers are supposed to have are those three components, the new, a knower, and the, what's the third one there?
Incontrovertible one.
Incontrovertible. Yeah. And the knower part, if I'm reading it correctly, says basically it eliminates all physical sense powers.
Right.
So I'm confused by the first two types of direct valid cognizers, because those appear to be based on physical sense, where the second one actually specifically says physical sense.
Oh, so what they're getting at there is, like, according to the Vaibhashikas, a physical sense power can be a knower. Whereas in this school, they would say the physical sense power is not the knower, it's the uncommon empowering condition for the knower. So the knower needs to have a sense, like, so, in other words, so to give rise to like what they're saying is that, for example, like, I'm gonna use the example of visual perception, right? That you have to have, that the physical, like, the Vaibhashikas, the previous school, right? They would say the eye sense power can be a visual knower. This school would say, no, the eye sense power is an uncommon empowering condition that allows the visual consciousness to be the knower, the perceiver.
So you're still using the physical sense, but you're using it to achieve something else?
You're using it to achieve an actual experience of knowing, and knowing by this school's definition is a consciousness. It's not a, so one way of saying it is that this school is differentiating between a consciousness and a physical thing, right? That the physical sense power is a physical phenomenon, and physical phenomena don't know. They're not knowers. The knowing is consciousness. Right. And that there's a difference. So really what they're getting at is there's a difference between consciousness and that which is physical. So from this school's perspective, they would say it's similar. Like, you could have a microscope, right? And if you want to see, whatever, the mitochondria or something, the microscope is the uncommon empowering condition for seeing that, right? Like, in other words, without a microscope, you can't see it, but you have to have a person. Whereas the microscope by itself can't see because it's not an awareness. So what this school is saying is that the eye consciousness is a physical object, just as a microscope is a physical object. Or I'm sorry, not the eye consciousness. The eye sense power is a
Right.
physical object, just as the microscope's a physical object, but that there has to be a consciousness there to actually do the perceiving.
So when you looked outside and saw green, that was just the physical part is not what's important, is that you were then able to process that in a certain way to, okay.
Yeah, yeah. And they would say the example, you can give another example. If a person is dead, let's say a person just died, well, they still have this physical sense power, but the consciousness is not, there's no consciousness that's capable of using that sense power to look around, for example.
Right.
So there has to be the consciousness there, or there's no valid cognizer.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then Lynn had a.
One of the things, I had two things. One, to Cynthia's question. I mean, animals have karma, right? And so when the tsunami came, I guess it was Myanmar, in Southeast Asia, they, the elephants knew that the tsunami was coming and ran to the mountains. So they saved themselves and the people didn't. And so there was something they sensed that the human beings couldn't sense, even with all our advanced whatever, right? And I sort of wonder if that's sort of the direct perception. That's sort of the direct knowing. I don't know anything about elephants and what they think or don't think.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's sort of like Cynthia's sort of instincts question is like, maybe that's sort of direct knowing. They knew because of their connection to the nature, they knew that it was coming and left.
Yeah, I agree. There must have been some kind of some kind of direct cognizer. I don't know in the case of elephants if it was a sense direct, you know, maybe they have some subtle sense power that we
don't know, but it sounds like direct knowing because they were right.
Yeah, so it must have been, actually they must have had, it would be logical, I think, your point, that they must have had some kind of valid, direct valid cognition. The question I don't know is, was it a sense direct valid cognizer or was it a mental direct valid cognizer? That I don't know about, I don't know enough about elephants to know, but you're right, there must have been a direct valid cognizer at some point for them. Yeah, that makes sense.
And then the other point, and you know, I don't understand this conceptually, I understand it experientially, you know, about the what is it, the yogic direct valid cognizers. I had this experience with my best friend from college. I was driving my daughter to pre-K or, you know, her wherever she went, Amazing Life Games, before I went to work, right? So I was pretty much not engaged mentally with a lot of stuff. And there were some friends that were supposed to come down from Boston, and I hadn't heard from them. And I was thinking, when is the date they were coming? And then I had sort of a black cloud go over my mind. And it was really powerful. And then I found out their son had died. Their son had drowned, which I had no way of knowing. I mean, I was in Washington, they were up there. I mean, it was just, something incomprehensible. And then I called and found out what had happened. But it was like, it was clearly a premonition or a sense of what had happened, but it was really scary.
Yeah.
And awful, you know. Mm-hmm. So I sort of think of that as the yogic.
Oh, that would be closer to the mental.
There was nothing perceptual. There was no sense of what was going on. It was just my connection to them.
That would be closer to the mental direct valid cognition. I mean, the yogic one would be more like a meditation on emptiness or selflessness, or so that would be like the mental. Where I was saying like clairvoyance, that would come under the clairvoyance would come under the mental direct valid cognition. Okay. Yes, that's one. When they say like where there's no sense, there's none of our sense powers are able to know something, but our mind has some kind of perception. So that would be under mental, not yogic, but mental direct.
Okay, mental, yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and there are many people who describe, like, there are many people who say, like, you know, suddenly I knew so-and-so had died, you know.
Right. Very powerful.
100 miles or 1,000 miles away, whatever it was. Yeah, they use strange experiences like that. Yeah, and they say that that sometimes that's through the power. They say that sometimes those arise through the power of karma, and sometimes they arise through the power of meditation. But yeah, I don't know. It's hard, it's very individual, I guess. Yeah, there are many examples like that, though, aren't there? That people sometimes share.
Well, I mean, it was also so striking because their son, who was 7 years old, had become a Buddhist. He was very not of this world, but very precocious, and he was very serious, and he knew he was going to die. So that was like part of this whole thing. Yeah.
Hmm.
Very weird.
Wow. I wonder if you had some karma, special karma with him, maybe. I don't know.
I don't know, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Hi.
Yeah, it's disturbing in a way, but I get it.
I
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I have a question.
Oh, sure.
So I wonder, are these kind of transcendent powers like clairvoyance, clairsentience, this kind of powers is part of our nature power, or they have some, related to our bodhicitta? Does it help with our bodhicitta?
Oh, I see. Yeah, they say a few things. One is, according to Buddhism, these things, like these kinds of experiences or something, they would say, one is like they're not common even to Buddhists. Anybody can have those experiences, like Buddhism would say that, and if you meditate and gain calm abiding, then they arise naturally in a way. So but I guess what they do say, so one is they can arise without bodhicitta, but what they do say is that, that's the reason why bodhisattvas cultivate those. So in other words, that there's a recognition, I think this is in line with what you're saying, that there's a very strong recognition that on the bodhisattva path that those cultivating those can allow you to be more effective in helping others. And so then that's a reason why bodhisattvas do cultivate those abilities or capacities that we all have as potential. So that, so sometimes people can have those just because of other reasons. Yeah, bodhisattvas cultivate them because if you can, like Atisha says that, if you can read somebody's mind, or there are stories like that, like if you know where somebody who died takes rebirth, on the bodhisattva path, then if you're a teacher, for example, like a great bodhisattva teacher, then you know where they are, so you can go help them. Or if you can read their mind, then you know how to help them as a teacher better. I don't mean somebody like me, but like a real bodhisattva, then yeah, they cultivate those.
Well, I think we probably need to be wiser to have this kind of abilities. Otherwise, they kind of cause problems for our daily lives. And it's confusing because sometimes we don't know if it's our own feelings or others.
Yeah.
Because I have this kind of empath feelings. I constantly feel other people's emotions, even physical illness. And sometimes I feel their thoughts, like feeling emotions before the language forms. And sometimes I got confused. Doesn't feel like my own emotions, but it's in my head.
Yeah.
So it's kind of confusing and causing problems. I don't like to feel other people's illness symptoms. Yeah.
Oh, I agree. So yeah, the main thing that would be one is I guess I'll make 2 points. One is there's a difference, what they say, one point is, of course, it's more reliable and clear if it arises through calm abiding. So that's one point. But the other point, I guess, is one thing is I guess I'll say a couple of things. One is, of course, if you use that when you're meditating to cultivate bodhicitta, that's very good, right? If you have a sense of knowing other people's suffering and then you use that to cultivate compassion, then that's a good thing. But also, actually, and this is not so much a point from Buddhist training, from the formal Buddhist teachings, but I was just earlier this year, I was reading some research that the Zen teacher, Joan Halifax, was sharing. And she was making a point about this, what you're getting at, which I really liked. She was making this point that sometimes too much empathy, actually, too deep of an empathic experience over too much, when it happens too much, can actually be disturbing, or it can lead to a kind of suffering, actually, for ourselves. And so she was making this point that while it's good to have empathy, that we have to know how to shift our attention away in a way, or sort of not focus on it too much, because there are times where it can overwhelm us. And I agreed with her. I thought that was really interesting observation. It came from some scientific research, but she was kind of sharing that. She shared some examples because I think she has those experiences. She was sort of giving some examples where she was helping others and so she was saying that, in order to continue our work for others, we have to know how to sometimes pull back in a way from those experiences, or shift our attention away from them, or we can get overwhelmed, actually, and it can cause obstacles.
So do you have any tips to pull back and cut off the connections?
Yeah, actually, what she said, which I agree with, actually, is like almost like to notice the experience, but then to shift our attention, actually, kind of like we do in mindfulness meditation. So to notice it, but then to shift our attention back to our own physical senses, like so like actually the key really, I think, is that you can't control that arises, but we can all practice, in our meditation is shifting our attention. So if you, there are two things actually that one can do in a moment like that I think are useful myself. One is to recognize, okay, I'm starting to get overwhelmed. Let me shift and notice my feet on the floor. I'm going to notice my breathing, notice my body. So you shift your attention to your physical senses. Or the other one is to shift away from, and sometimes we get confused about this, I think, but to shift away from the experience of empathy for the other suffering, to shifting into one's own heart, to love, or to compassion, or to some kind of positive emotion like that, but not to focus on the experience of the actual pain, let's say, because that can be what's overwhelming. So you can either focus on your own physical sensations, or you can focus on love or compassion or bodhicitta or something, but to actually shift your attention away from whatever that is back to something that's grounding for oneself, I think. And and then it may come back, the empathy moment, and that's okay. I mean, certainly my empathy is very important, but if it's overwhelming, to keep shifting our attention back to something else, I think that's my own opinion of what's helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Lauren, would that be, in that example, would that be an indicator of how far we have in our practice of compassion and bodhicitta in a way? So for example, like, Mother Teresa, she seemed to just be able to give so much without maybe the distress that one might feel. Is that whereas, like, I'm not even an empath, so I know I'm way below what Sula is even talking about. But is that like, would that be a measure of how, I mean, I understand kind of you do only so much, but would, as a personal, like, how well am I going the path of the, bodhisattva, would that be an indicator?
You make me think of, actually, is that famous story of Avalokiteshvara, like where Avalokiteshvara was meditating on compassion and freeing beings from suffering. And, he had made the bodhisattva vow. And they say, right, that at a certain point, Avalokiteshvara had incredible empathy, right? And they say that he even after working for a very long time to help others, he felt how much suffering there still was. And they say he felt such despair that he was like going to give up, actually. And then they say he exploded, and then Amitabha came, and like, that's how they have the 1,000-armed, 1,000-eyed version of Avalokiteshvara, is Amitabha healed him, and he became the 1,000-eyed, 1,000-armed version, the 1,000 pieces that exploded, and 1,008 heads, and not 8, 3, 6, 9, 10, 11 heads, 11 heads and 1,000 eyes and all. But and so the idea there, though, is like, in a way, even Avalokiteshvara in that story, right, got overwhelmed. And then it was through the blessings and the healing of his guru that they say that though, that then he was able to see more, if you think of it, he had 1,000 eyes after that. Somehow he became able to see and respond spontaneously to even more suffering than he could before. But I think that story for me always embodies that there are these moments where it's like, even for me, it's like, it's been helpful to sometimes remember that story of Avalokiteshvara, because like, even for Avalokiteshvara, there are moments where it's too much, and then it isn't, because his ability to manifest compassion expanded after that. But we're all like that in a way. There are stories also of, and I think there is an important point you're getting at too, which is like, there's a story of Shariputra, where he had just given rise to bodhicitta actually, and then he got totally overwhelmed by an evil being's requests for, like demanding too much of him. And he gave up. And that's why he became an arhat, not a Buddha. He gave up his bodhicitta at a certain point. And so the idea is that we have to be careful in a way when so I mean, that is true in a way. I guess you could say that for all of us, we have to judge where we're at and not let ourselves get too overwhelmed, I think is what those stories embody. So we have to, open ourselves to empathy for others, but not so much that we give up or get so overwhelmed that we can't continue. So it's a balance, I think, for all of us as people. Yeah, but they do say the people's ability, like there are these bodhisattvas who can see the suffering of all these different realms and can, and then, but they have somehow, they have that capacity. But we shouldn't, but the story of Shariputra, I think, gets at, if you try to go past where you're at too quickly, it can actually harm your practice, so we have to be careful.
I have a question about the mental direct perceiver, not related to clairvoyance, but preceding the conceptual mind. How is that related to a generic image? Because I know that it's so quick we're not perceiving it, but what the generic image that we have, for example, if we see mother, there's an image of mother that's a composite of many aspects of her, and then there's a knowing that she's mother. So is there a relationship to the image and the mental direct perceiver? Because sometimes it feels almost like our generic images are so fast that that we're not even aware of what we're doing.
Yeah, this is something I actually it's a good question. I actually was that time, I don't know, maybe a month or so ago, when I was asking Khensa Rinpoche some questions about these things. I was kind of asking about some of that, and he made a point that I didn't say it this way, but what I took from it was that you could say it this way, that like we are not, again, first of all, like I said, we're not, as ordinary people, we're not aware of that instant of mental direct valid cognition, that first instant of it. But there's a difference, though. I think it's an important point, is that like the mental direct valid cognizer is let's just say this right, you could say is a positive knower, is not an eliminative knower. It knows directly a functioning thing, which means a thing that can give rise. Like, so a mental direct valid cognizer knows a specifically characterized phenomena. In other words, a specific tree. I'll give you the example, right? Whereas the generic image, I think that you're getting at, is a knower by way of elimination, right? That knows. So it comes after. Like, so let's say so first you might have this instant of, if it's a mental direct valid cognizer of a tree, right? That would be knowing a specifically characterized phenomena, which is a specific tree that the eye consciousness had perceived. And then after that, when you said the generic image, that's a eliminative knower. That's a mental, that's a different kind. They're both mental images, though, aren't they? The first is a mental image of a specifically characterized phenomena, which is a functioning thing, a specific tree that gives rise to seeds and its own results, which are future trees and whatever, all kinds of things. But the second one, the generic image, is a negative, eliminates everything other than tree, and is a conceptual, right? Blends the word tree and the generic image of tree, and is mistaken for the actual tree. So the first, so they're two different kinds. They're both mental, but the one is a direct perceiver of an actual, what's the word? Yeah, functioning thing, and the second one is an eliminative knower that's a mental image, a different kind of mental. But they're both. That was what Ken Sherman was pointing out. They're both mental images, but one is a direct perception, which means it's not of a eliminative knower. It's of a specifically characterized phenomena. Whereas what you said, generic image are always generally characterized phenomena. So it's not that. Yeah.
Would the mental direct perceiver actually precede the generic image, and it's just we can't get at it that fast? No.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. All right. So I'll now continue on to the so the next in this same section are inferential valid cognizers. And so we'll go on to those. So, and again, because there were two types of valid cognizers. One was direct, which we just covered, and the other is inferential. So I'll read the definition of an inferential valid cognizer is a new, incontrovertible, determinative knower that is produced in dependence upon a correct sign that is its basis. And so I'll just pause there, right? So again, because it's a valid cognizer, by definition, right, we already covered that, it has to be new and incontrovertible and a knower. But this inferential one, right, arises in dependence upon a correct sign. What does that mean? That means reasoning, right? It arises through the power of reason. But and again, what's important though is that it's incontrovertible, right? It actually knows. And if it's a valid cognizer, it's new also. All right, but it's incontrovertible, meaning that it's a logic that gives rise to an experience of actually knowing something in a definitive way. And earlier we said there were 4 kinds of direct valid cognizers. Here, Justin Schweigelsen points out, according to this tenet system, there are 3 types of inferential valid cognizers. And I'll read them and then we'll go through them, just like we did the previous. So there are inferential cognizers by the power of the fact, inferential cognizers through renown, and inferential cognizers through belief. That's the way that he translates them, but we'll go through each one. So an illustration of an inferential cognizer by the power of fact is an inferential cognizer realizing sound to be impermanent by the sign product. So I want to say, so this one actually, what he's calling by the power of fact, refers to, let's just say right. Is what we use to know slightly hidden phenomena. In Buddhism, there are things that can be known by direct perception. There are overt phenomena, there are slightly hidden phenomena, and there are extremely hidden phenomena. So slightly hidden phenomena can be known by ordinary persons through the power of reasoning and logic. And I want to point out, so this one, so these are like, where you come to know something definitively, and you know it. Let's say right, through a power of reasoning. And the example they give here is knowing sound is impermanent because it's a product. So that's a common example in Buddhist philosophy. What they're saying is, because sound is produced by causes and conditions, right? It's a product, it's produced due to causes and conditions, it's impermanent, right? It's instant, right? It's momentary. And that we can, and we don't necessarily, you don't know that unless you think about it, right? But if you think of like, a drumstick hitting a drum and it creates sound waves, and the eardrum hears them and so on, you can recognize, oh, wow, yeah, like through logic, you can recognize, and through kind of reasoning through that, you can recognize that's impermanent. There's nothing permanent about the sound of a drum, right? About when somebody pounds the drum once and there's a sound, that's not a permanent phenomenon, it's impermanent. So that's the example they're giving. And I want to point out that we know things through the power of the fact, or the power of this kind of reasoning, slightly hidden phenomena. That's something that happens all the time, right? Like, I mean, a simple example is if I'm alone in my house, like for the weekend, and then I were to go downstairs and see that if I cooked something for lunch and 3 hours later I went downstairs and saw that the stove was still on, right? I would look and go, oh my gosh, the stove is on. This is dangerous. And then if I said, well, I used it 3 hours ago, no one else has been in my home, therefore I left the stove on. You know, that would be an example of knowing through the power of the fact, right? Where it's like, nobody else could have done it. You know, the doors are all locked. I'm the only one here. I would hear if somebody went down the stairs. Nobody, I didn't hear a sound. It had to be me. I didn't remember doing it, but now I know I did it. Right, that would be an example of this, right? So we do those and all I'm pointing out is we do this through the power of the fact every day. This is something, it's something that we do in our Dharma practice sometimes, like knowing sound is impermanent or knowing selflessness, but we also do it in normal daily life all the time. John, you have a comment?
Well, it's a question, and it's just that this section, it's very important to understand a word that your example made perfect sense to me. In that example, what is the sign product?
Which one?
The one you just used about either the stove, knowing it's a fact. I'm trying to understand the concept of correct sign or just sign in general here.
Oh, I see. So yeah, so in that instance, it would be they're correct. Well, actually, I would say it this way: the correct sign would be so the thing to be proven is I left the stove on in my example, right? The correct sign is there's no one else. That there was no one else in the kitchen between the time I found it on and the previous time I had turned it on would be the correct sign. So there was no other person who could have possibly. So the correct sign would be there was no one else who could have done it.
So the sign is the validation?
The sign is the proof, actually, you could say. Proof. The sign is that which proves, so product proves impermanence. The lack of another person available to do something proves, if I was the only person there and there was no other person there, that proves I did it, in my example. So it would be that which, it would be the evidence or the proof, you could say, that which proves incontrovertibly that a certain thing happened. And we'll get into it in a few minutes. There are incorrect proofs, and there are proofs that are not determinative. So there are other kinds of proofs, but this would be a reason, like a proof that actually proves the point.
Right.
Yeah, so it'd be that, or a simpler. Anyway, you get it. Yeah,
I understand and I appreciate it.
Okay. Good. Okay, so that's the first one, and again, those allow us to know slightly hidden phenomena. So there are many things, and actually, if you think about many of the things we know, about the physical world are known in this way, aren't they? Like through reasoning, through logic. There are many things like that. Then the second one, right? Inferential cognizers through the power through renown. And the example here, an illustration of an inferential cognizer through renown is an inferential cognizer realizing that rabbit bear is suitable to be called by the term moon by the sign existing among objects of conception. Let me explain that. I don't think the English is clear there, but what this second one is getting at is terms. What they're really saying is this: is anything can be called anything. And so this one is, in other words, when somebody says, like, if, let's say, what they're saying here, rabbit bear, like, actually, what is it in the old? What was it? Anyway, in Tibetan culture, they say some say, oh, if you look at the moon, you can see a rabbit. So the moon is the rabbit bearer. There's a term in Tibetan. And what they're saying is there actually a rabbit there? No, of course not, right? It's the moon. But you can call anything anything. And in a certain culture or a certain place, if we say, when I write poetry, I say rabbit bear and it means moon. And then you go, oh, okay, from now on, when I read Tibetan poetry and I see rabbit bear, I know it's moon. And in this context, that's the word for that. That term means that. So what this is getting at in a way is like, this could even be in your own family though. Like, like sometimes families have these, like, I was thinking about this the other day, like it could be a certain, if you're learning language as a child, if somebody points out, oh, these are glasses, then you learn the term glasses, right? There's nothing intrinsic about the term, that sound, glasses, that refers to this, but it's a valid cognition in the sense that in the English language, that's the right term. But even a family can have those things, like how families, like, I remember as a kid, my grandfather used to have a sense of humor, and he would sometimes make up a word for something, and then it became like a joke in our family. And so somebody would sort of use that phrase, and everybody would know, oh, they're referring to this, and it was a joke. But there was no, so if somebody new came into the, if somebody, like if a friend of mine came over when my grandfather was there, and they would say, what's he talking about? And I would say, oh, that's a joke. When he says that, he means this. Then the person would have a valid cognition. Oh, okay. That's what that means in this family, or whatever. This, when they're joking around and somebody says that, they're referring to that. So there's nothing, the point being, so that's where it says here, by the sign existing among objects of conception. What they're saying here is the correct reason actually is, well, anything can refer to anything. So in a given context, once you know what that group of people, what term that group of people use, it can be a valid cognizer, because there's no right or wrong intrinsically to this. Does that make sense? It's just a matter of, it's the same thing with the name, right? Like if somebody, I was thinking of that, like when somebody changes their name, right? Whether, like, I think, they take ordination, right? A Buddhist ordination, they change their name to a Sanskrit or a Tibetan name, or somebody gets married and they change their name, right? Whatever, like, there is, and then so then you say, now this person's known as this, right? And that's a valid cognition at that point. If the person says, that's my name, and the people around them decide, agree that that's what they're going to call them, then that's their name. There's nothing intrinsic about names, whether it be of objects or of people. So this one is a valid cognition that's known. So through the power of renown, the reason why they say renown is just whatever's common, whatever's the common usage in a way. That's that one. And the third one is inferential cognizers through the power, here they're calling it the power of belief. And I'll read the description, then we'll talk about it. An illustration of an inferential cognizer through the power of belief, for example, an inferential cognizer realizing that the scripture, due to generosity, this is a scripture from Nagarjuna, due to generosity comes wealth, due to ethics comes happiness, and so on, is incontrovertible with respect to the meaning indicated by it through the sign, a scripture verified by the threefold analysis. And there I'll pause. Like, so what this one's getting at is, the previous two are easier. This one's getting at how do you know things that are extremely hidden? That's what it's addressing, right? And in Buddhist literature and in these teachings on pramana, actually, what they say is the other ones are quite straightforward, aren't they? I mean, so but this one, where they're saying the power of belief, what they're getting at is so it's something, they're saying, giving the example of something asserted by a scripture, right? A Buddhist scripture. And what they're saying here is incontroversial with respect to the meaning as indicated by the sign, a scripture verified by the threefold analysis. So I want to just describe what's this saying? What is the threefold analysis? And what that's saying is, just because something is asserted, and actually the Dalai Lama often talks about this, right? That whereas you can't accept a Buddhist scripture as literally true just based on the fact that it says something in the scripture, because, for example, Buddhist scriptures contradict each other, and so on. And so this, the teachings on pramana say that a scripture must be free of three kinds of contradiction. And I'll go through them. So one is, the scripture cannot contradict your own direct perception. So in other words, that's the first of the three, right? So it's saying, if you're going to say, well, the Buddha said this, right? Then you still have to check. Well, first of all, does that contradict my own direct valid cognition? If it does, then my direct valid cognition outweighs the quote, so to speak. Or is that as you trust your own eyes and ears, not something because an authority said it. That's the first of the three contradictions. The second is reasoning. And the third is other valid scriptures, right? So what they're saying, you get the point here. So just because the Buddha, so what this is saying, this point is, this third kind of valid cognition is not, I have a valid cognition just because the Buddha said so. What it's saying is that you have to take what the Buddha said and, first of all, check in relation to your own direct perception. Then analyze it logically. And then compare it to other scriptures. And through a logical, and oftentimes you'll see, if you read like the teachings of Lama Tsongkhapa, he does this quite a bit, where he'll say, he'll quote two different contradictory scriptures of the Buddha in many of his teachings. And then he'll say, you have to use reasoning to determine which is correct, you know. And then he'll say, here's my reasoning for why I accept this one and not that one. You know, and so, and actually there's so many Buddhist scriptures that you could find a quote to support many different things. So that's why also the Dalai Lama often says, reasoning is the most important. You know, and there's this famous, if you ever, lately, I mean, sometimes I watch those, like they're on late at night where the Dalai Lama is talking, you know, live stream teachings. And, you know, Dalai Lama is not shy, isn't he? Like he'll say, you know, Vasubandhu says, you know, the earth is shaped like this. I disagree with him. You know, it's a famous Buddhist scripture, the Abhidharma Kosha. The Dalai Lama will say, I don't agree with the Abhidharma Kosha because, you know, whatever, like, you know, science has shown that the earth is not shaped like that. It's, you know, there's the central planet, you know, there's not a central Mount Meru and 4 continents. There's a round planet with this many continents and the oceans and so on. So I don't agree with, you know, so he'll say, I don't agree with Vasubandhu, for example. And so that's an example of, right, there is relying on reasoning and direct perception, I suppose, if you've flown around the earth a few times, as he has. So the point is here, what they're getting at, though, is when trying to know something that's extremely hidden that we can't know through direct perception, if you're not capable of knowing it through direct perception and you're not capable of knowing it through simple reasoning based on direct perception, then you can refer to an authority, but you should analyze that authority. And actually, this would apply not only to Buddhist scriptures, but to other authorities, right? What this is saying is, if an authority tells you something, the correct approach is to apply that message to this kind of threefold reasoning, right? So not just Buddhist scriptures, but any authority, if they were to tell you something, does it contradict your direct perception? Does it contradict reason? Does it contradict what another authoritative source says? And that you have to come to your own, and part of what they're getting at here is you have to come to your own valid cognition eventually, right? Through your own deep analysis, because these are difficult points. And I want to point that out, like, these are hard to know, right? There's direct perception is easy. Things that are slightly hidden are slightly difficult. You know, you have to reason a fair bit. These are very difficult to know. And so you have to rely on a lot of analysis and research to come to a valid cognition on an extremely hidden phenomenon. And that's why they call it extremely hidden. But what this is getting at is that those things are knowable, right? Through a process of deep analysis and deep research, so to speak, right? And if you, I will say that, like, I'll just share that reflection, actually. Like, I was, earlier this year, I was reading, like, Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary on the Abhisamaya Alamkara, which it mentions many different, you know, extremely hidden phenomena, right? With the nature of bodhisattvas' experiences and what bodhisattvas go through at different bhumis on the path. Those are not things that are the object of, for bodhisattvas at those levels, they're direct perception, but for me, they're extremely hidden, right? Because I'm not at that level of the path. But so what Lama Tsongkhapa was doing is he was saying, this Indian master said this Tibetan master said that, this other Indian master, he would go through, you know, maybe sometimes 15 or 20 different masters' comments. And then he would say, here's my own reasoning process. Based upon all those different pieces of evidence and what other scriptures say and what the Buddhist, you know, what the Buddha himself said and what this person said. And then you would analyze the nature of what I know about emptiness and what I know about bodhicitta and so on. And here's the definitive, here's my stance on that, and here's my definitive answer on this question. But you can tell he had spent years analyzing that point. So it's not some, I guess my point is, so this last one, the power of belief, isn't just like a simple process. Even the one, the power of fact, the power of the fact, like knowing subtle impermanence, can take years actually to realize inferentially. So these ones can take a lot of effort. So they're not saying, I just want to emphasize that point. This threefold analysis or threefold reasoning is not saying like, oh, you sit down for 5 minutes and you say, oh, now I know. It's saying you really think deeply about it. You really analyze deeply. You really weigh the research. And because when you come, as we're going to get to, when you come to a valid cognition, you're beyond the point of doubt. And we're going to go through what's the process of coming to valid cognition, which will clarify this further. So maybe I won't say more about it because that's the next section actually. But I'll just finish this section before we get to that. So it says, so that was the point about power of belief. Then it says, an inferential cognizer through renown is necessary an inferential cognizer by the power of the fact. What that's saying really is just, the one of renown, right, is the word. What word refers to what? And so what it's saying is, what's the power of the fact? The fact is that anything can be known as anything, right? That there is no intrinsic relationship between terms and what they refer to. Therefore, the power of the fact is, oh, that's what this, there is this group of people really do call, Tibetans really do call the moon rabbit bear. And you can talk to a number of Tibetans and you start to realize that, and you see their poetry and you realize, okay, and the power of the fact is, moon has no intrinsic name, therefore it could be called by any name. That's the fact, so the logical reason is there is no intrinsic name of moon. It's just that moon is just an English term, right? In Tibetan, it would be dawa, is the actual moon term for moon. But so the actual fact, or the what's the word? The correct sign would be there is no intrinsic relationship between terms and what they refer to. Therefore, any group of people can come up with any term and it can refer to an object. And so then you just have to know in a given context, what's the term. Then it says, if it is a direct perceiver, it is not necessarily, this is making a different point here. It's saying if something is a direct perceiver, it is not necessarily a direct valid cognizer. And if it is an inferential cognizer, it is not necessarily an inferential valid cognizer. Because the second moment of a sense direct perceiver apprehending form and the second moment of an inferential cognizer realizing sound to be impermanent are subsequent cognizers. So what that's getting at is not all valid so there are direct perceivers that are correct but are not direct valid cognizers. Why? Because they're not new. Does that make sense? Remember, one of the terms is new. So that it has to be that first moment. That a pramana, a valid cognizer, is new, meaning it's that first moment of knowing, right? So the subsequent moments of knowing that same thing are correct knowers, but they're not pramana, if that makes sense, because they're not the first moment of knowing it, according to this school. Again, according to Prasangikas, they would all be valid cognizers. The subsequent cognizers are valid cognizers. In this school, they're not. So in the example, like if you were to have a first moment of knowing selflessness, that would be your pramana, right? If you were in meditative, a yogic direct perceiver, if you were in meditation, and when a bodhisattva gains direct realization of emptiness, that first moment would be pramana, would be this direct valid cognizer. Then they would continue to meditate on a direct perception of selflessness, but it would be a subsequent cognizer, so it wouldn't be pramana in that sense. It would still be a correct cognition, but it wouldn't be a pramana, a valid cognizer. Because valid cognizer, one, a definition is new. That's all they're saying, right? So there are correct inferential state cognitions and correct direct cognitions that are correct, but they're not pramana or valid cognizers because they're not new, because that's part of the definition, as we said. And then here the author says, this is so because Dharmottara's commentary to Dharmakirti's ascertainment of valid cognition, pramana text, says, the first moment of a direct perceiver and the first moment of an inferential cognizer are valid cognizers. Later moments of those cognizers, since they are not different in terms of establishment and abiding, being continuation of those are not valid cognizers. so you get the point there, right? What they're really, all this is just getting at is that one of the words for the definition of pramana or valid cognizer in this text already given was new. So if it's not new, then by definition, it's not a pramana or valid cognizer, but it can still be a correct perception. All right, we still have a half hour. And so I'm trying to decide, this next section for me is very profound and important. So I'm just going to pause for a second. We can start it, or I should pause anyway. Did people have questions about what we just covered, or should I go on? Go on. This next
Lauren?
section, oh yeah, sorry. Oh,
Oh,
go
sorry.
ahead.
This sounds hierarchical in question, but does the school say that the one should, like we're talking to other schools about, what level of enlightenment or awareness do schools focus on? Does this school say the best thing is to be a yogi direct valid cognizer, or does it say the best thing is to be an inferential valid cognizer of belief? I mean, is there a thought that one should try to achieve a certain level?
Yeah. So eventually, actually, and that's connected to what we're about to cover. So,
Then we can wait.
yeah, actually, maybe I'll explain. Actually, maybe I'll answer your question in reference to what I'm about to cover, because I think it's important. Actually, it's an interesting and complex point that you're getting at. In general, I guess I'll say this though. In a general answer, first of all, this school does value greatly inferential valid cognition. I mean, that's considered an important part of the spiritual process, because part of our progress is reasoning to come to correct inferential valid cognitions. But ultimately, where we're headed is yogic direct perception. Whereas you won't become liberated from samsara without a yogic direct perception of subtle selflessness. So ultimately, we need to come to a yogic direct perception of subtle selflessness of persons to achieve liberation. That's the ultimate sort of, I mean, that's the ultimate truth. That's not the ultimate truth. That's what's liberative. That's the right way to say it. That's what allows us to be liberated. But along the way, we need to, in order to progress towards that, in order to progress spiritually in a general sense, we need to cultivate inferential valid cognitions in order to better understand the nature of the path and the nature of ourself and the nature of spiritual practice and so on. And this next section will explain some about that. So I'll actually start it, because I think it'll help us understand that. So here it says the definition of non-valid cognizer is a knower that is not new and incontrovertible, right? So in other words, so here we're getting at what are non-pramanas, non-valid cognizers. And this text lists 5 types: subsequent cognizers, wrong consciousness, doubt, correct assumptions, and awareness to which an object appears but is not ascertained. And later, I'm going to go through each of those. They're in the text here. They're all defined in the text. But for a moment, I want to just pause and emphasize just a few of them to make a point that's related to John's question. And that I think is useful. For me, it's been very useful for my own practice. So I want to not continue with the text for a moment, but actually just share something related to practice that I think connects to John's question. So I'm going to skip over subsequent cognizers for a second. And I'm going to start with wrong consciousness. Because from a spiritual perspective, in terms of our practice, this is really, I think, very useful. That there is actually, it's funny, when I say wrong consciousness, right? For the most part, what we'll think of is, like, usually when we think like wrong consciousness and wrong consciousness, and it says here, is a knower that engages its object erroneously or incorrectly, right? And I always sort of chuckle when I think of this, because usually when we think of wrong consciousness, we think, oh yeah, a lot of other people do have wrong consciousness. Usually we think of others, right? And right now in the world, given the nature of our society, people, all of us sometimes, I think, or most of us are sometimes a little crazy, right? Thinking crazy in how much we're emphasizing others' wrong consciousnesses. And what Buddhism here is saying, and what this school is saying, is when focusing on wrong consciousness, focus on your own. That's where you can actually do something, for the most part. That's the most important kind of wrong consciousness, right? And so the idea in this hierarchy, and this is a kind of hierarchy, is that we look for is that spiritual practice actually is where a big part of spiritual practice, I don't want to limit it to this, but this is what this is getting at, is that one of the most important things we can do in our own spiritual practice is to seek out and identify our own wrong consciousnesses, right? So you look for, where am I engaging erroneously, engaging incorrectly with things, with myself, with the world. And then there's a process actually that I want to describe very briefly that people go through that I think is interesting, which is, when you first have a wrong consciousness, you believe your mistake, right? So the next one, if you look at this list, is doubt, right? And it says in the text here, there are 3 types of doubt. There's doubt that leans in the wrong direction, there's neutral doubt, and there's doubt that leans in the right direction, right? And actually, I think this is really important. So I'm just going off on it's not a tangent, it's actually describing, I think, some of the value of this teaching, which is a prominent teaching, a low-rig, mind and awareness, prominent teaching, is, so in spiritual practice, what this is implying is we as individuals have to find, where are my wrong consciousnesses? Where am I going wrong? Okay. And the first step in progress is doubt leading in the wrong direction, where you actually say, I think I'm right, but maybe I'm wrong, right? And what this school is saying is that's an important moment, right? That many of us never get to, right? Many of us as human beings never doubt our wrong consciousnesses. So spiritually, the first step is to go, wow, I really believe I'm right, but maybe I'm wrong. That's doubt leading in the wrong direction still, right? And then you start to wonder, and you start to think and analyze, right? And this is reasoning now. Now you're engaging in the process of inferential reasoning. And if you continue reasoning, it can take hours, it can take months, it can take weeks, months, years, decades, right? This process can take various lengths of time, depending on how profound the question is, right? And what they're saying is it's a hierarchy. You start with wrong consciousness, then you have doubt leading in the wrong direction, usually. Eventually, you might come to neutral doubt, right? Where you start to go, wow, I really believed that, but now I don't know. Could be this and it could be that, right? That's neutral doubt. And you see how that's progress, actually, and in the world, you can see that, right? Like for ourselves or for anybody, like that's humongous. When you come from really believing something wrong to admitting, actually that's the level of Socrates, isn't it? Like I just thought of that, right? Where he said, to know what you don't know, right? That would be neutral doubt in a way. What Socrates was getting at was like, neutral doubt is very profound. It's where you start to go, I don't know the answer, right? So actually Socrates at least got to that level of his own, in some cases more, but that's what he was getting at in a way, right? And then you continue on and you come to doubt leading in the correct direction, right? And that's usually putting it in the vernacular, right? That's where somebody might say, I'm not they feel or they say to themselves, I'm not quite sure, but I think it's like this. And what they think it is actually what it is, but they don't really know. They still have two minds about it, right? Doubt means you have two minds. You're going back and forth. You're not certain, but you're very much in a polarity, and you have a doubt between two possible answers. And what I want to point out is this. I just want to pause there and say, like, a couple things. One is, again, like the goal here is to address our own wrong consciousness and to go through a process. Another point I want to make is it takes a commitment. And I'll share, like, I think it was like last year I read Thupten Jinpa came out with a new beautiful biography of Tsongkhapa, of Lama Tsongkhapa. And what he describes is Tsongkhapa's own process with this related to emptiness. And that Tsongkhapa spent decades, like he studied emptiness, he contemplated emptiness, he meditated emptiness, he had experiences, but he still had doubts, And then he went in years of retreat to meditate on emptiness. And he had visionary encounters with Manjushri, but he wasn't satisfied, right? And my point is like, there's an integrity to that process. It's to saying, I don't know what I don't know, but I'm going to really, when it comes to a spiritual issue, is compassion better than selfishness, right? Is emptiness correct, or is it just something the Buddha said? Like, those are really important questions spiritually, right? Those are like the most important questions, right? Is bodhicitta the correct, all the Buddhas say bodhicitta is the correct way. Shantideva says, all the Buddhas say bodhicitta is the best way to live, right? But do you have a valid cognition of that? Do I have a valid cognition of that? That's a very hard question, right? Same thing, like the Buddha said, emptiness is the ultimate nature of things. But do I have a valid cognition of that? And one point I want to get at, I want to say this, like, there's a famous quote from Aryadeva, who was Nagarjuna's primary student, where he says, regarding emptiness, even having a doubt about this matter tears samsara to shreds. It's a very famous quote from Aryadeva. And the commentaries on that say, what he's getting at is, when he says doubt, he's getting at this, but he's getting at doubt leading in the correct direction. That when somebody comes to the level of spiritual practice, where their relationship to emptiness is doubt that leads in the correct direction, at that point, that doubt will tear samsara to shreds, because it will then they will continue on in their inquiry about emptiness and eventually come to a valid cognition of it, which will actually end samsara eventually for them. So this is a very profound point. Does that make sense? So, and it's getting a very deep, where we have to really, like, because oftentimes we deceive ourselves. We say, oh yeah, I believe that. I believe that the Buddha was right about this or that. But we're not really doing the work of analyzing. So I would say, so I would challenge you, like, to actually ask yourself, regarding selflessness or emptiness, which level am I at? Honestly, about those kind of matters. And to continue on, right? So you start with wrong consciousness, then doubt leading in the wrong direction, neutral doubt, doubt leading in the correct direction. And the next one here in this list, I'm going from 2, 3 to 4. I'm just going to cover those 3. 4 is correct assumption. And correct assumption is a factually concordant, determinate knower that is controvertible. Remember, pramana, like valid cognition, is incontrovertible. Correct assumption is controvertible with regards to its determining object. In other words, a person who's come to the level of correct assumption with regards to emptiness, that's a remarkable achievement, right? But it's not yet incontrovertible. The person doesn't know it in a definitive way, if that makes sense. But it's a remarkable achievement with regard to something like emptiness to come to the point of correct assumption, right? And I'm just pointing this out because oftentimes, we say, oh yeah, I believe that. I believe the Buddha was correct. Everything's emptiness. Or I believe the Buddha was correct. Bodhicitta's or I believe it's correct. Everything's impermanent. But what I find very useful about this framework from the Lorig teachings, I just want to share it, is it's a way of looking at, it's a mirror or a guide to looking at your own experience and to assessing, where am I at now? Where am I at in regard to any point? Impermanence. You could take any point of spiritual practice, right? There's the 4 thoughts that turn the mind. There's all the points of the Lamrim. There are all the points of many, many Buddhist teachings, right? So many different Buddhist teachings. And you can take any teaching from the Buddhism and ask yourself, where am I at in relation to those, in relation to this ways of knowing that? And I want to point out, and when you're engaging in a process of what we're calling inferential reasoning, right? So I just want to point out, so you start off with the wrong consciousness, usually, sometimes with doubt. If you start with the wrong consciousness, so you go from doubt leading in the wrong direction to neutral doubt. It doesn't have to always go each step by step, but usually it does actually, to doubt leading in the correct direction. Sometimes you may fall backwards and then get more doubts suddenly, but that's actually being really honest with yourself and saying, do I still have doubts? Does that make sense? That's the value of debate also sometimes. The monks and nuns debate in the monastery sometimes. It's to get at these points, to raise your doubts, to address them. That's part of the benefit of debate and discussion with Dharma friends, like we can do. And eventually, if you come to doubt leading in the correct direction, that's quite an achievement. Then you come to a correct assumption, right? Where you've thought about something a lot and you go, wow, I really believe this. I've thought about it so much. Like with regards to emptiness, you come to a point where you feel like a kind of conviction, right? A correct assumption could include a kind of conviction, a kind of like, wow, that really seems to be true. That's amazing. That's still correct assumption, right? And then eventually you come to pramana, right? To an inferential valid cognition, right? Where it's no longer controvertible. It's not just, wow, I really believe that, or wow, that makes sense to me. But it's like you actually know it in a way that's incontrovertible, meaning definitive, right? And when it comes to emptiness or selflessness, that's what then eventually leads to the direct perception. Then you meditate on that inferential cognition, and you meditate it on again and again. And as they described here, if you meditate on that with a combination of calm abiding and special insight, you'll eventually come to a yogic direct perception of emptiness, but a yogic or selflessness. But according to this, what we're describing here, right, a yogic direct perception of selflessness is preceded by an inferential cognition of selflessness. Does that make sense? So you have to first have an inferential cognition of selflessness through reasoning, and then you meditate on that repeatedly, and you eventually will come to a yogic valid cognition, a yogic direct valid cognition of selflessness. So that really is a more detailed answer to John's question now of how it's like a step-by-step process that relies on reasoning, which eventually comes to direct perception. And for us, I just want to emphasize this point though. I really think for me, there's been humongous value in like, so like if you feel like regarding emptiness, I'll just use that as the example because you're in the class on tenets, you all have some interest in that, right? So sometimes I suggest, you don't have to do it, but I suggest homework, like something to work with. And I would suggest that we'll go through more detail about these different, these 5 ways of knowing, 5 non-valid cognizer ways of knowing next time. But what I want to suggest is to actually, regarding, say, something like emptiness or impermanence, to actually introspect and to say, all right, well, what level am I at with regards to that, right? With regards to impermanence, subtle impermanence, or with regards to the teachings on emptiness. And I'll say one other point I'll say is, Gyume Kensho was talking about this topic, and he said, of course, like when somebody gains a direct yogic direct valid cognition of emptiness, they become an Arya being, right? Oh, I said that. That's a direct realization of emptiness. But one time, Gyume Kensho was saying, when somebody achieves the level of inferential valid cognition of emptiness, he said it's a completely transformative experience. Like for that person, it's like a humongous transformative moment. And they won't be the same again, in a sense, that in that life. It's like this kind of remarkable achievement, actually. Where through a process of reasoning and contemplation over and over again, over time, and I think that's what the Dalai Lama gets at. Sometimes he describes this moment where he felt like an experience like being struck by lightning, he says, when he was young, and he was contemplating emptiness over and over. And he says, he had this experience where it was like, he said it was like being hit by lightning, and he went to his teacher, right, Lingwa Rinpoche, and asked him about it. He was I think he says that, he implies that. He was talking about the inferential valid cognition of emptiness. So that's what Kensho Rinpoche was kind of referring to. Same idea. But so those are come to through a process, is all I'm pointing out. And I think it's wonderful to ask oneself, so when it comes to, emptiness, in my own contemplation, am I yet, am I at the level of doubt leading in the wrong direction, at least? Probably if you're in class on tenets, you're at least at that level, right? We are if we're studying this topic, right? We're wondering about it. We're not sure that things exist in a self-existent, substantially existent way, and so on. But anyway, does that make sense though? That this map of cognition, this is a map of ways of knowing, is very, it's not just something for other people. It's not just some kind of abstract thing. It's a mirror through which to look at your own mind, actually, to look at your own experience on a spiritual, in terms of the spiritual practice, right? And I would say the same thing, actually. I gave the example earlier, I was talking about emptiness and impermanence. The same thing, right? Like there's a, in the contemplations on bodhicitta, right? There's a point in the contemplation of bodhicitta that says, self-cherishing or self-centeredness, I call it, is the cause of suffering, and love, cherishing others, is the cause of happiness. Right? That's a teaching of Buddhism, Buddhist teaching, right? That self-centered attitude is a cause of suffering, and the cherishing others and love and compassion is the cause of happiness. And again, I would just challenge us to contemplate, wow, how, where am I at? There are people who are totally wrong. I know many people are at the wrong consciousness level, where they would say, there was that line in an old movie, it was some movie from the 80s, greed is good. Right? There was a line like that in some movie, whatever. Like, so there are many people though who would say, no, being selfish is good, right? That's a wrong consciousness. According to Buddhism, that would be a wrong consciousness. Right? The question I would raise to us, again, just to contemplate is, okay, so regarding that contemplation related to bodhicitta, where am I at? Do I have doubt? And one way of getting it, and you might say, no, I'm at the level of at least correct assumption. I have definite faith in that. But then I would challenge you, like, so if somebody, in the moment when somebody insults you and says something you can't stand, do you deeply believe that cherishing them is the cause of your happiness? See what I'm getting at? Like, that's the way to ask these questions. Like, and when somebody cuts you off in traffic, and is screaming out their window, with a red face, whatever. If you have and part of what Ken Rinpoche was getting at that day was, if you have an inferential valid cognition of some point like this, it will impact you in that kind of moment very powerfully. Even when somebody's screaming at you, or they're cutting you off, whereas if you have doubt, if you're at the level of doubt, it won't help that much in that moment, because your conviction is not very strong, right? And so if you have doubt leading in the correct, if you have, let's say, neutral doubt or doubt leading in the correct direction, that helps you some. But you see how each level you progress in this process of moving towards valid cognition, it also becomes a more effective tool for you in dealing with life. And you can tell how far along you are by those challenges that come. And last thing I'll say is also that, for me, that's also like, just actually, I often share these kind of things, but my closest friend, we have these conversations about Dharma often, and he's one of my old friends, and for me, that's also like this, like so just the other day, it was yesterday, I called him up to catch up, and he was going to do a retreat this weekend, so I called him before the weekend. It started today, it was a long weekend, and in the middle of the conversation, he says to me, what did he say? He said, what gets enlightened? We say we want to get enlightened, but what gets enlightened? And it came out of the blue, and I had to pause for a second, and I was like, and for me, it's like that challenge is like, it's getting at this point. How well do I, for me, it was an interesting moment, because I was like, well, how well do I know the answer? In other words, I can come up with an answer. But for me, the interesting point was like, how deeply do I have a cognition of that answer? So do I know it in the moment, or am I coming up with some sort of, oh, well, so-and-so said this, where I'm coming up with something from a quote from a book that's not really something I actually even have a correct assumption about necessarily, or not. So my point is like, there are different ways to get at, and that's also like, last thing I'll say, I remember this also many, many years ago, Geshe Jampa, who was my teacher who died later of cancer, he was describing debate in the monastery, and he said, like, he was a Larampa Geshe, a great scholar, but he was saying as a young monk, he had loved this, that one time he was debating, and he was debating with like a very good other scholar, and the other scholar took the position there's no such thing as karma, I think it was, and no such thing as rebirth. Took a nihilistic position. And he said, like, at a certain point when he was debating with this guy, he thought, wow, I might lose this debate. Maybe there's no such thing as karma, and and then he had to come to a clarity in order. He won the debate, and the other guy was wanting him to win the debate, I think, but was really challenging him, like. And my point is like, I think what he was saying was that other debater helped him find his own doubt that he hadn't known he had. Does that make sense? It's like by presenting a position that he hadn't yet fully articulated to himself, this other debater made him face his own doubt and go like, wow, maybe it's not true, and then he had to come to, well, how do I win this debate, not just with this other guy, this other monk, but with myself, right? And that's and what my teacher, he was one of my early teachers, what he was saying was that's the purpose of debate. It's actually to face your doubts, it's to find them, it's to uncover them in order to gain clarity in this process of coming towards valid cognition. So we need to do that in our own way. For me, it's talking to my friend, or sometimes it's your guys' question. Sometimes you guys ask questions, and after this class, I think about them because I realize, like, that's the process, right? We should do that with regards to each other's questions. Sometimes when I listen to teachings by the Dalai Lama or Khyentse Rinpoche, it's like, well, how will he answer? I'll pause. Somebody asks a question, I'll pause and go, how would I answer that question? Part of it being, do I know the answer to the question for myself? If I don't, then where am I at in this process? Does that make sense? And so I'm just pointing out that's a way to help ourselves learn. So next time we'll go over the details of these points, but I think there's a huge gift in this teaching, and I just wanted to share that with you because for me it's been a gift to know this teaching and apply it to where am I at? What's my own process?
Can I?
Oh yeah.
Can I ask, I know you said to contemplate on bodhicitta, that's great, but did you also mention a book or something called Contemplation on Meditation, or did I misunderstand?
No, I didn't say a book. No.
Oh, I was thinking you maybe knew some book or so. Oh, okay.
No. I was more saying to apply these teachings to that. I was saying
yes,
to apply these teachings.
Yeah. Then I thought maybe there was something that, actually like some guided something, how they have.
No.
Okay. Very good.
No, I was just saying, like, when you know those teachings on bodhicitta contemplation, to apply this and say where, like, regarding, say that happiness is that. I'll give you an example, like that love is the cause of happiness. Do I know that? How do I know that? How deeply? Yeah, that's what
I know. That's going to be my homework.
That's a great one, right? Isn't it? Like, do I have a valid cognition that love is the cause of happiness?
Yeah.
Or do I just have faith? Do I just because somebody said it? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, and Lynn, that's it.
You mentioned clarity. Is clarity like the first step toward realizing emptiness? In other words, is it a step to realize emptiness directly or by meditation?
I can't remember in what context did I say? I'm not sure when I said clarity.
You said that if you meditate, well, you talked about the debate between the teachers, the scholars, and you said the validity of that was that the person, your teacher, said, well, that helped bring me clarity. That emptiness is real. I think that's what you were, the example you gave. So is the clarity the emptiness? It's like, yeah, I mean, or is it on the path to emptiness? Is it like a first step to get the clarity and then you can realize emptiness directly?
I see. In this I guess, there, for one thing, I'm sort of pausing because I'm realizing in Buddhism, there are so many different, I probably should use a different word because clarity has so many different meanings in Buddhism, particularly, like, because the nature of mind is clarity, we sometimes say clear light and so on. There are many, and then we use the word clarity sometimes to refer to emptiness. So the word clarity itself in Buddhism is one of those words that has so many layers of meaning that I'm realizing it's probably confusing, just even if I use that word. Because clarity can, sometimes in some Buddhist texts, clarity refers to emptiness, and others it refers to the conventional nature of mind, and sometimes it refers to a way of knowing. So I could see why that'd be confusing, but yeah. So I mean, so sometimes when they actually use the word objective clear light to refer to emptiness, actually, but in this context, I wasn't meaning it that way. I guess more what I was meaning was like, you know, I guess I should say what I was really getting at, I think, in that context was how do we come towards knowing anything, knowing something, and like, you know, so it's interesting. Yeah, clarity is a funny word choice, like because I guess like what I was more getting at was this word. I probably should use the word they used, which is incontrovertible. Like in other words, do you know something in a way that's that's really what I was getting at, I think, was like that my teacher, when he said he came to know that whatever it was he was debating about in an incontrovertible way, that point, because he had faced every doubt, he came to a point where he knew something in one particular thing, whatever it was he was debating, in a definitive way or an incontrovertible way. That's, I think, what I was referring to there. And so, yeah, we have to gain that. Regarding emptiness, you have to come to eventually you need to come, through reasoning, you have to come to an incontrovertible or definitive or insight into that. But remember that what I'm talking about there is when it's through the power of reasoning, that's you eventually come to an inferential valid cognition. And then when you meditate on that inferential valid cognition with calm abiding and eventually unify it with special insight, that's what eventually then will give rise to yogic direct perception of that. So it's a whole process. I think that's what you're getting, is it's a process. And what this is saying is that inferential reasoning about emptiness comes prior to direct perception of emptiness.
It sounds like the person in Florida, I forget his name, I'm terrible on names. We had a class.
Oh, yeah.
What, silent illumination, yeah. And so, yeah. So what he talked about was seeing things through a perfectly clear glass mirror. And it sounds like that's a little bit like what you're talking about. You get to that stage and then you go further in direct perception.
Yeah. Actually, one time, it was a very similar point. Ken Rinpoche said one time, I like this metaphor. He said, he was talking about the difference between knowing something through inferential reasoning and knowing it through direct perception. And he used this analogy. He said, if you imagine like touching, like if somebody were wearing, so, actually, well, the analogy he gave was that once you have inferential cognition, he said it'd be like touching another person's arm through a very thin fabric. In other words, you're not actually touching their arm. You can feel the shape of their arm, you can know about their arm, but you're not actually touching their arm. And then he said, if they take off that fabric from their arm and you touch their arm like that, it's a direct touching. And he said, he was giving an analogy where he said, that's what it, like an analogy is similar to what Gogu was saying, but that was Ken Rinpoche's analogy. He said, so when you come to an inferential valid cognition, he was making the point, it is a way of knowing. You do know the person's arm through fabric, but you don't know it directly. Then, so he was saying that's the difference. And that they come one after the other. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, similar point. All right, we should probably, move over. So we should do the dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In this snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara. Well, thanks, everybody. And we do, I checked, we do have class next week. So next week, we'll go through the details of these different ways of knowing. So if you think a little about them between now and then in terms of your own experience, hopefully that will be then not just an intellectualism, but actually useful for contemplation. So you can really then use these. I really hope that's a gift to be able to use these as a tool for all any part of your spiritual practice in the future. I think it's a wonderful tool, this section. But, thanks. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Laura.